We come to the 35th presentation in the Parayana, and we've been looking at the origins of civilization and how it has a structure to its spiraling through time, and that civilization is a major transformation of high culture due to the appearance of written language, which could be read and written, which changed the dimensions of consciousness in the way in which Homo sapiens developed. This happened about 4350 BC. And it took a while. It took about a period of 350 years for that initial achievement of a written language discursive enough to be able to convey meaning, and not just the inscription of signs to hold business accounts, king lineages, and so forth. That transformation of a written language is a symbols transformation. But the ability to command reading and writing entails a second transformation, which is I have to use a alchemical term here. It's a distillation of a previous transform that was a fermentation. The previous transform came about 40,000 years ago, and it took a while for that 40,000 year ago transform to refine itself so that it had an amazing structure. The transform was the development of art. The first appearance that we know of cave paintings and of sculpture dates from about 40,000 years ago. The earliest cave in southern France, Cosquer, and so forth, date back to about 36,000 years ago. And when they were discovered just very close to the port of Marseille, France's second largest city, it astounded everyone because it was so close to where civilization has been very formative for quite a long time. But the entrance to the Paleolithic caves there were buried under 130 feet of water. That the Mediterranean 40,000 years ago was not at all the Mediterranean Sea that we know of. And the entrance to the cave was blocked. And at the cost of several lives, brave French divers, and the French excel in diving due to Jacques Cousteau and his companions developing the aqualung and so forth a long time ago. I remember when it first was coming out in the late 40s. And going through what was a tunnel from the cave mouth into the cavern was not only a tunnel now silted over from tens of millennia, so that it was opaqued, almost like a colloidal solution, and the divers would lose their way, and several perished, but some finally got through. And the original cavern held the first patterned cave painting ritual cycle, where you could go in an ambulation around the pockets of paintings, the pockets of sculptural effects, and see that it was an initiation. It was a ceremony of complex initiation. And this was a transform that fermented the change from the old Paleolithic to the high Paleolithic, to the development of what we today anthropologically correct style as culture. That a culture has its ritual comportment structured and organized so that there is obviously an instruction, a background, a deeper meaning, a kind of a wisdom in the myths, in the mythology, in the oral language. And that this then, after some very long time, the species Homo sapien has existed for about 200,000 years. And Homo sapiens first left the East African milieu about 50,000 years ago. So it took about 10,000 years in long travelings, coming up to new landscapes, new places, new life histories and events, and the relating of what used to happen where. And all of this built a tradition. And the practice of the old and then the new and then the new became custom. So that custom and tradition and the oral language as stringing together the myths, the poignant, significant ways in which the human family in these expanding bands conducted their lives and had their meaning and developed their person. And out of that came the visionary quality of being able to understand that this is a magical, mystical dimension that was not there before and only patiently has come to be, that it is not only a viable new dimension to the time and the space of nature, but that this was accepted by nature as being an illuminating part of it. And that the vision in changing the way in which the natural cycle used to be created a new social refinement to the cycle of nature. And that social refinement and the rituals from nature, from the animals, from the plants, and so forth, coalesced to make a transform of language, so that the oral language became mythic in the sense that it was able to stylize increasingly how all of this links together and has its pattern. And so there are patterns in culture. One of the great books that we use in the learning civilization is Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture. This quality of Homo sapiens, sapiens then, who were wise about being wise. Yes, the species was wise, Homo sapiens, but it became Homo sapiens sapiens, wise about being wise, because of the refinement of language, because of the ability to take a transforming change so that the rituals, yes, they were still natural, still nature-based, but they had an extra visionary dimension of magic, as they called, in whatever language they had. And that this magic required of them to have a new way of living in the world, of comporting in nature, of talking about this newness. And a great French anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Breuil, coined the phrase participation mystique, that culture in a higher form with vision and then the refinement of expressing it in images, which were the origins of art. So that with vision and art, a recursive improvement came in the rituals which became ceremonies, with the myths that became a mythology, a practice of linking them together, and that the telling of the myths in their primacy was not done by rote. Anyone who has ever heard, quote, native speakers deliver myths understands that it is a spontaneous event. When I, as a young professor in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, 44 years ago, brought Hansen's bear paw, an old blind Blackfoot sage, a sachem, to deliver in downtown Calgary at the Indian Friendship Center. I pioneered having the college have the course half there and half downtown in the Indian Friendship Center. We had about 115 students and more than that of native peoples who came to hear, because this is the venerable sage of the Blackfoot in their Algonquin language are Siksika. One walks the way so well trodden that one's moccasins have turned black over the centuries, over the lost mists of tradition, Siksika. He spoke only Algonquin, and he spoke in even though he's in his 80s, in such an original, spry, fresh way, because he had his storytelling stick, his cane, as it were. And I used to, at that time, bring a cane from Cameroon, West Africa, that was a storytelling cane from the ancient Africans. And this is the way in which the rhythm of the movement in dancing, it's called stepping, that one has a rhythm to the language that allows for the weaving, a complex weaving, not just the warp and the woof, but complexity which avails someone who is masterful at this of scores and scores and scores of possible weavings, of possible ways, and of the patterns then that emerge in this spontaneous weaving give this visionary participation mystique. So those hearing hear in such a way that they are, and they live in not a myth from then, but from a presence now, and that the now becomes absorbed into the presence, and so a presence becomes a field of differential consciousness within which now a great transform has happened, that vision and art as two more dimensions, a fifth and a sixth dimension, so that a sixth dimensional play happens. And it is this ancient quality that was again refined, distilled out of the wine of the fermentation of vision and art into the distillation of history and science. A seventh and an eighth dimension. So that what came into play with a discursive written language that could be read, the mind became expanded not just in neuronal networking and activities. Different languages have different areas in the brain in which they constellate their language, and the written language refines it so that it is possible, once you have learned to read and write a language, you can learn to read and write another language, and other languages, so that one is able to pick up a universal quality of reading and writing, of the discursiveness of a consciousness now that has a historical dimension. And that was the gateway for the development then of the ability to, through the participation mystique, to be in the presence of the animals, of the trees, of the food, the grains, and so forth, but also then to begin to transform them, to, as the word used to be, to tame them. And in the taming came the taming of ourselves, of mankind, of Homo sapiens sapiens. That the dimension of history was extremely important in the development of civilization. And so when we look at the ability for a written language to not only be discursive in the reading of it, in the writing of it, in the reading out loud of it, it took about 2,000 years, from 4350 BC to 2350 BC, for there to arise a world-class author, and her name was a woman, was Enheduanna. And she was the one who was able to bring the written language of cuneiform, which had been used for business, had been used for king lists, had been used in a sign way, in which had been developed so that it began to have a symbolic reading and writing ability, but she raised it to the full distillation, that is, that a poetic language, written and read and understood for the very first time, came into being. When that occurred, it was like a reference wave trigger, that at last it was the ability to have a poetic where the art of reading and writing reached across not only through history into the scientia, the real knowing, the detailed, exact knowing, but was able to reach all the way back in a recursive symmetry, because symmetry is one of the great triumph goalposts of the way in which a universe and its cosmic origins can move, one foot after the other, one hand after the other, that there is something in a syncopation, in a rhythm, in a gesture of balance, in all of these aspects. That first reference wave had 2,000 years later an aeon of its reference wave having become a poetic. And that poetic language infused the ability for whatever written symbolic languages like cuneiform were operative, that they were now changing, they were distilling, so that one was able to use a set of symbols to overtone and to undertone, to change the very way in which a written, read language can incorporate complexity. And that came with the development of an alphabetical language about 2000 BC, which happened in two places at the same time. It happened in the ancient Phoenicians on the East Mediterranean coast, and it happened in Central Asia around Samarkand. And out of the Phoenician came eventually the linear A, which became Greek. It became the origin of Hebrew. It became the origin of many languages. And in Central Asian, the language was Avestan. And by about 1925 BC, the classic wisdom in Avestan was Zarathustra's Gathas. At the very same time, the classic written, read, alphabetical language became the vision of a promised land of Abraham to go to the origin of where the alphabetical language had started. And so at the same time that Zarathustra is writing his Gathas at age 75, Abraham at age 75 made the pilgrimage from northern Iraq around where Erbil is today to the coast where Lebanon is today in search of the promised land. And that it was recognized that there was a great development that had happened because a deeper transform had happened to the alphabetical language in the Phoenician version of it. And that is that it had contact with the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic. And so midway between Lebanon and Egypt is that great ridge upon which stands the cities of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and at the more ancient trade route, Hebron. And so it was in Hebron that Abraham bought his first piece of property in the Holy Land. And that marks the tent pole beginning. It was called the Cave of Machpelah, and it was bought by Abraham to be a burying place for himself and his wife and for his descendants. And they were buried there. And in 2014, August 30th, you can go to Hebron and they are still there. Of course, monumental buildings have been there. There are notable exceptions that the burials are not there. But what happened that was extraordinary was not only that the language had become visionary and artful, so that there was a history, so that there was a lineage, but that the carrier wave of that lineage was feminine. The operative application was masculine, but the carrier wave was feminine. It's not only that the so-called patriarchy is only carried by the feminine. The same is true when you go to the inheritors of the ancient Avestan. Those persons, about 400 years after Zarathustra wrote his Gathas, I spent 10 years making a translation of the Gathas into a 21st century English poetic. Here's an example of 1925 BC poetic. in 21st century American poetic. I ask that about penalties, those deceitful forced gains of evil action. O Ahura, no life honor followed. There the shepherd separates the flock. Virile and righteous is he. That's the Good Shepherd origin. I ask this: which is the person in whose home is Kshathra? Kshathra is an ancient high dharma, distillation of the fermented transformed patience. This is the place of Asha's kingdom. Asha is the feminine order of life applied by the males, but continued, and the wisdom was feminine, that this is the flow of it. And without the flow of it, what are you applying? Something memorized from rote? It's not alive. The species belongs, the world belongs to the living. This is the place of Asha's kingdom. Here we try to bring about our union with Ahura Mazda. Ahura is the masculine lord of the horizon, and Mazda is the radiance of the feminine wisdom which receives all of this and gestates, generates life and its context of love. That without love, there is no life, and without life and in love, there is no civilization. And one of the themes of today is that the regressions that ensue from that are monumental. They tear apart all of the forms of civilization. And one goes back to the last time that there was stability. And in that panic, there are a couple of classic last times that are like supposed to be catch-alls, but they are nets that are torn and old, and they fray, and one falls further and further back. To say that it's barbarity is a polite term. Worse than beasts. Here we try to bring about our union with Ahura Mazda, what will be and by which deeds. And which, righteousness or deceit, you must now choose. Higher, a wise insight always awakens, not to be ignorantly astray. Be as Mazda, Ahura, teaches, by revealing your pure mind. No one deceitful can be taught mantra listening. Mantra is the Avestan origin of the word mantra. There's no way that without wisdom you can hear wisdom at all. Both in city house and country village, open an exacting place to disperse destruction and death tendencies. it becomes a universal apocalypse if left untended. A resisting without weaponry. Its solution is a resistance without weaponry. No force, but a resistance utilizing a field source that is not force. What is a field source that is not force? Time. Time has forms. And in civilization, the time forms are immense. But they are finite. And they are set to re-transform, to refine. And the more that civilization developed and became complex, the more that it was incumbent on those understanding, on those living and loving in that sourcing, recognizing that it's the litmus test is the spontaneity. If you're working from a plan, you're wrong. Yes, you can plan. You can't work from it originally. One of the most incredible tearing up of custom and tradition happened in the early 1920s in Europe. And one of the great figures in that was a little Swiss man, little portly, named Wolfgang Pauli, who later on teamed up with another Swiss genius, Carl Jung, and they wrote a little book together about the great significance of Johannes Kepler's revolution of astronomy and physics and mathematics. Wolfgang Pauli received the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1945 in Stockholm, and in 1947 this original edition in English of his German language acceptance speech is entitled Exclusion Principle in Quantum Mechanics. And in this, he divulged in Stockholm in 1945 that it went all the way back to where he was a young physics professor. And he went, as he says, to an amazing event. He went to where, following Niels Bohr's invitation, I went to Copenhagen in the autumn of 1922, where I made a serious effort to explain the so-called anomalous Zeeman effect, as the spectroscopists called a type of splitting of the spectral lines in a magnetic field, which is different from the normal triplet. The spectral lines in a powerful magnetic field are affected in a way because magnetism, though related to it, is different from electrical. The magnetic will spiral around the vector of a magnetic encased electrical current, which then can be made into a line, into a wire. But the electrical field will spiral. In fact, it chirally spirals like a continuous helix around the vector of the line, of the dynamic, of the electrical energy and this electromagnetism, both aspects are carried by the photon, by light. What was difficult in 1922 was the realization that something here is incomprehensible in terms of all the physics known up to that point from the beginnings, especially going back to the ancient Greeks. And eventually it produced, and from the break, after the break we'll come back a little bit, it produced a quality of wondering which was in a milieu that already had been seeded by a great historical realization. The realization came into focus in 1906, published in Chicago, Illinois, by the Open Court Press. Chicago at that time was one of the great Renaissance cities in world civilization. It's called Zarathustra and the Greeks by Lawrence Hayworth Mills, L.H. Mills, who was at Oxford and who came to the United States. And out of this, one had a great celebration in a part of East Bay, San Francisco, of Mills College in Oakland, being a great place, especially for teaching jazz. And I once lived across the freeway underpass from Mills. When we come back from the break, this first part is entitled Zarathustra, Philo, the Achaemenids, and Israel. Because Zarathustra relates to Abraham aeonically, going back 4,000 years. They're tuned, they're paired. They have a quantum entanglement. They have the same distill, transform, refinement, 0 BC. Let's take a break.